George, remembered by history as George Augustus Frederick FitzClarence, the first Earl of Munster, the eldest illegitimate son of a king, a soldier who bled for his country across the battlefields of Spain and India, a scholar who published books that still survive in libraries today, and a man who, for all his titles and all his courage, could never quite outrun the quiet shadow that birth had placed upon him from the very first moment of his life. He was born carrying royal blood that the law refused to recognize, raised in a house full of warmth and laughter and debt, the eldest son of a prince who would one day become King of England, and of an actress the whole country adored. He grew up knowing exactly what he was by blood, and exactly what he could never be by law. He went to war while still a boy, and he fought with genuine courage. He came home a published man, a decorated officer, a husband and a father, and when his father finally took the throne, he stood at what seemed like a threshold, the eldest son of the King of England, waiting for the recognition that blood had always promised him. The earldom came. It was not enough. The years that followed were filled with quarrels, with financial desperation, with a mind that slowly turned against itself. And on a quiet March morning in 1842, in a house in Belgravia, he reached for the pistol his uncle had once given him as a gift. Tonight, we follow that journey from the very beginning. Good evening and welcome back to Sleepy Crown Reborn. If you've just subscribed, welcome to the family. And if you're returning to us again, welcome back home. It is a pleasure to have you here. Tonight, make yourself comfortable, lower the lights, and let the day gently slip away. Over the next few hours, we'll share the calm, complete story of George FitzClarence, the first Earl of Munster, the eldest illegitimate son of King William IV of the United Kingdom, a man whose life carried him from a royal household at Bushy House to the battlefields of the Peninsular War, from the temples of India and the pyramids of Egypt to the gilded corridors of Windsor Castle, and finally to a quiet, tragic end at the age of 48. We'll move gently through his birth into a remarkable and unconventional family, his years as a young soldier under Wellington's command, his travels through India and Egypt, his marriage and his children, the earldom that came with his father's kingship, the slow fracture of that relationship, and the final darkening of a life that had, for a time, shone with real promise. All of it told slowly and with care to help guide you into rest. And if you have a moment before you drift off, a gentle like and a quiet comment about which part of George's story moved you most help keep these tales coming. To understand the life of George FitzClarence, it is first necessary to understand the world into which he arrived, and what that world thought of children like him. England, in the closing years of the 18th century, was a place where rank and legitimacy were everything. The great families of Britain organized their entire existence around the question of who had been born on which side of a marriage ceremony. A child born within wedlock inherited titles, estates, expectations, and a place in the ordered hierarchy of society. A child born outside of it, no matter who their parents were, carried a mark that no amount of wealth or achievement could fully erase. They were called natural children, or base-born children, or more bluntly still, bastards, a word that carried no particular cruelty in those days, only legal precision. It simply meant that the child had no claim in law to what their blood might otherwise have given them. And yet the world was not always consistent on this point. The royal family of England, the House of Hanover, had, by the 1790s, accumulated a remarkable number of illegitimate children. The sons of King George III were, as a group, well known for their informal domestic arrangements, their mistresses, their debts, and their cheerful indifference to the kind of respectable behavior their father repeatedly urged upon them. Several of the king's brothers had taken actresses or society women as long-term partners, acknowledging the children that resulted and providing for them as best they could within the limits of what the law allowed. It was in this context, this strange half-lit world between royal blood and legal exclusion, that George FitzClarence came into being on the 29th of January, 1794. His father was Prince William Henry, Duke of Clarence and St. Andrews, the third son of King George III and Queen Charlotte. William was, at this time, 30 years of age, a compact, energetic, sociable man who had spent much of his youth at sea and had developed, through long years in the Navy, a blunt and rather unceremonious manner that would mark him for the rest of his life. He was not considered handsome exactly, though he had a warmth about him that people tended to find disarming. He had been made Duke of Clarence in 1789 and had since then been living largely on his parliamentary allowance, which was never quite enough to cover what he spent. He was, in the kindest possible assessment, not a man who managed money well. His mother was Dorothea Jordan, and she was, by almost every account of the period, something extraordinary. Born Dorothea Bland in County Waterford, Ireland, on the 22nd of November, 1761, she was the daughter of Francis Bland, a stagehand, and his mistress Grace Phillips, who had herself been an actress. Dorothea had grown up without money and without privilege, and she had found her way to the stage through nothing more than talent, determination, and a quality that even her critics acknowledged was genuinely rare. She had come to London in 1785, taking the stage name Jordan, a name she had adopted somewhere along her journey from Ireland, and she had appeared at the Theatre Royal, Drury Lane, where she quickly established herself as one of the finest comic actresses the English stage had ever seen. William Hazlitt, one of the great literary critics of the age, wrote of her with barely contained admiration. Her face, he said, was irresistible. Her laugh did one good to hear. Her voice was eloquence itself. It seemed, he wrote, as if her heart were always at her mouth. Leigh Hunt considered her the finest actress of the day. Charles Lamb's praise was no less warm. Even Lord Byron spoke of her with admiration. It was at Drury Lane that the Duke of Clarence first noticed Dorothea, around 1790 or 1791. The attraction was apparently immediate and mutual. He was a royal duke with few prospects for legitimate advancement. She was the most celebrated comedic actress in England, a woman who had already survived several difficult relationships and who came with children of her own from previous partnerships. By the standards of respectable society, their union was irregular in every direction, and yet they began a life together, and it would last, in its essential form, for the better part of 20 years. Dorothea moved first into the Duke's home at Clarence Lodge in Roehampton, and then, after 1797, into Bushy House, a comfortable, sprawling residence in Bushy Park near Hampton Court, which came with the Duke's new appointment as Ranger of Bushy Park, a position granted to him by his father, King George III. It was at Bushy House that the family would put down roots, and it was there that George FitzClarence, born, in fact, at Somerset Street, Portman Square, in London, before the move to Bushy, grew up alongside his brothers and sisters. Between the years 1794 and 1807, William and Dorothea had 10 children together. George was the eldest. After him came Henry, then Sophia, then Mary, then Frederick, then Elizabeth, then Adolphus, then Augusta, then Augustus, and finally Amelia. All of them were given the surname FitzClarence, a name formed in the old Anglo-Norman tradition, from the prefix Fitz, meaning son of, and Clarence, which was the Duke's title. It was a name that announced both their royal connection and their illegitimacy simultaneously. They were, in the eyes of the law, private persons. In the eyes of the world, they were something harder to categorize. The surname had its own small history. The prefix Fitz had been used for centuries to denote the illegitimate children of noble or royal fathers. There had been Fitzroys, sons of kings, and now there would be FitzClarences. The children were also granted, eventually, the rank and precedence of the younger children of a marquess, a recognition of their blood that stopped well short of royal status, but placed them, at least formally, somewhere in the social order. Life at Bushy House was, by most accounts, unusual and lively. The Duke was fond of his children and took an active interest in their upbringing, even as his financial difficulties mounted steadily. Dorothea continued to act throughout these years. Indeed, she had to, because the Duke's parliamentary allowance was never sufficient to maintain the household in the style he preferred, and Dorothea's considerable earnings from the stage were a necessary supplement to the family income. She was, in the most practical sense, helping to support the household of a prince. The press of the time found this arrangement irresistible, and there were endless jokes and cartoons at the Duke's expense, some of them cruel, some merely wry, playing upon the word Jordan, which was common slang of the era for a chamber pot. The Duke affected to ignore them. Among their neighbours at Bushy and Hampton Court were the residents of the Grace and Favour apartments at the palace, people who had served the crown in various capacities and been granted accommodation as a reward. William was reportedly a popular figure among this community, a great favourite at the informal dinners they held together, a man at ease with company and noise and laughter. He described Hampton Court itself, with characteristic bluntness, as the quality poorhouse. For the children growing up in this household, the texture of daily life was shaped by both their father's rank and their own ambiguous status. They were royal grandchildren, grandchildren of King George III himself, and they knew it. They were educated accordingly. George, as the eldest son and heir to whatever his father could provide for him, received what was described as a comprehensive education. He was sent first to a private school at Sunbury in Middlesex, and then on to the Royal Military College, an institution that prepared young men for commissions in the British Army. He was, even as a child, being pointed toward the military life that would define his early manhood. And yet, there was something else running beneath the surface of these years, something harder to name but very present in everything that followed. George and his siblings knew, from as early as they were capable of knowing anything, that their position was conditional in ways that the children of legitimate marriages were not. Their father loved them, and their mother adored them, but the law did not see them. The throne, which ran through their blood as surely as it ran through the veins of any royal child in England, would never be theirs. And George, as the eldest, felt the weight of that understanding most keenly of all. Before we follow George into his adult life, it is worth pausing to consider the woman whose talent and labour made so much of that life possible. His mother, Dorothea Jordan. Dorothea's story is, in its own right, one of the most remarkable of her age. Born into poverty and illegitimacy herself, her own parents had never married. She had risen entirely through the force of her gifts. She had survived a young womanhood full of difficulty, including a relationship with a Dublin theatre manager who had promised her far more than he ever delivered, and several subsequent partnerships that had produced children but not stability. By the time she came to the attention of the Duke of Clarence at Drury Lane, she was a woman who had already learned in the hardest possible way what it meant to rely upon herself. Her career at Drury Lane and beyond was genuinely stellar. She played comedy almost exclusively, and she was considered by her contemporaries to be without equal in that genre. The great roles of the Restoration comedies, the sprightly heroines, the witty young women in breeches parts, the characters who moved through the world with a kind of irrepressible physical delight, were her natural territory. Audiences came specifically to see her. Theatres filled when her name was on the bill. She earned serious money by the standards of the era, and she continued to earn it throughout her years with the Duke, supporting not only her own children with him, but also the children she had brought from her earlier relationships. She was, by all accounts, a woman of considerable personal warmth. The Duke's biographers noted that she was fond of William's half-brother, an earlier illegitimate child of William's named William Henry Courtney, born before their relationship began, whose mother was unknown. Dorothea took this child in and cared for him alongside her own. He would later go to sea in the Royal Navy, and in 1807 his ship, HMS Blenheim, was lost in a gale off the coast of Madagascar. 590 men went down with it, including this young man, who was 19 years old. Dorothea mourned him. She also, it must be said, continued to act even when she did not need to, or perhaps more precisely, she continued to act because the stage was where she was most fully herself. The Duke may have been the social centre of the household, but Dorothea was its emotional and financial spine. Without her income, the family at Bushy House would have been in serious difficulty long before the arrangement finally ended. And it did end. In 1811, the pressures that had been building for some time finally became too great to contain. The Duke of Clarence was in serious financial difficulty. His debts had accumulated beyond the point where his parliamentary allowance could manage them, and Parliament itself was growing restless about the amounts the royal family required. There was pressure from above and from within the family for William to find a legitimate wife, someone who could provide him with a legal heir and whose fortune might ease his circumstances. He was, at this point, fourth in line to the throne, and the question of the succession was not entirely theoretical. The separation of William and Dorothea has never been entirely explained to everyone's satisfaction. Some accounts suggest it was largely driven by money, that William needed a wealthy bride, and Dorothea stood in the way of that. Others suggest the relationship had simply worn thin with time, as 20 years of any partnership might. What is clear is that the separation was formalized in 1811, that William provided Dorothea with a financial settlement, and that the children, all 10 of them, largely remained with their father rather than following their mother. Dorothea's final years were painful. She lost much of her financial security when her daughter, Augusta's husband, ran up large debts in her name, debts that fell to Dorothea to cover. She returned to the stage to try to meet them, but her health was failing. She eventually retreated to France to escape her creditors, not out of disgrace exactly, but out of a practical necessity that was nonetheless deeply humiliating for a woman who had earned so much and given so freely. She died at Saint-Cloud, near Paris, on the 5th of July, 1816, at the age of 54. She was buried in the local cemetery there. The children, including George, had little contact with her in those final years. He was a grown man by then, already a soldier, with campaigns behind him. But the loss of the mother who had laughed and performed and kept the household alive through her own extraordinary gifts was part of the landscape of his adulthood. It is there in the background of everything that came after. Whether he acknowledged it or not, George FitzClarence was appointed a cornet in the 10th Hussars on the 5th of February, 1807. He was not yet 14 years old. This was not, by the standards of the era, quite as extraordinary as it might sound to modern ears. The British Army of the early 19th century commissioned its junior officers young, sometimes very young, and the sons of noblemen, or in this case, the sons of a royal duke, were often entered into regiments as a matter of course. their commissions arranged through family connections before they had finished their formal schooling. A cornet was the most junior officer rank in a cavalry regiment, roughly equivalent to an ensign in the infantry, and it was considered entirely appropriate for a boy of good family to begin his military career at this level in his early teens. Even so, there is something striking about the image of this 13-year-old boy, grandson of the King of England, son of a duke and an actress, educated at Sunbury and Marlow, being handed a commission in one of the army's most distinguished cavalry regiments, and pointed toward a war that was already gathering momentum on the Iberian Peninsula. He did not wait long before seeing action. In 1808, he went with the regiment to Spain, part of the British force being committed to the conflict that would become known as the Peninsular War. This was the long, grinding, often brutal campaign that Britain fought alongside Spanish and Portuguese forces against the armies of Napoleon Bonaparte, which had overrun the Iberian Peninsula and placed a French king upon the Spanish throne. It was a war that would last, in one form or another, until 1814, and it would produce some of the most famous battles in British military history. George arrived in Spain in time for the opening disasters and the retreat that followed. The British force under Sir John Moore, which had advanced into Spain with the intention of supporting the Spanish armies, found itself in a terrible position as the French tightened their grip and Spanish resistance collapsed around them. The retreat to Corunna, fought through the bitter winter of 1808 and into January 1809, was one of the most grueling episodes of the entire war. Men died not only in skirmishes with French cavalry, but of cold and exhaustion and hunger, dragging themselves through snow and mud toward the port where the Royal Navy was waiting to take them off. It was in this retreat that George served as aide-de-camp to General Slade, attached to the command staff rather than fighting directly in the line, but present throughout. The Battle of Corunna itself, fought on the 16th of January, 1809, was the rearguard action that allowed the army to embark. Sir John Moore was killed in it. George was there. He returned to England with the evacuated force, and then, before a year had passed, he was back in the peninsula. He returned this time in a different capacity, as a galloper to Sir Charles Stuart, who was serving as Wellington's adjutant general. A galloper was an officer attached to a senior commander's staff, whose job was to carry orders quickly across a battlefield, riding between the commander and the units under his direction. It was a role that required horsemanship, coolness under fire, and physical courage, because it placed the officer in the open and in motion precisely when those around him were trying to find cover. George served in this capacity through the campaigns of 1809, 1810, and 1811. And then, in May of 1811, the war reached a moment that George FitzClarence would carry in his body for the rest of his life. The Battle of Fuentes d'Onoro was fought on the 3rd, 4th, and 5th of May, 1811, in the borderlands between Portugal and Spain, as Wellington's army faced a French force under Marshal Massena that was attempting to relieve the besieged garrison at Almeida. The fighting was fierce and concentrated, with the village of Fuentes d'Onoro changing hands multiple times over the course of the battle, and the Allied right flank coming under severe pressure from a French turning movement. Wellington, characteristically, held his nerve and his line. The French eventually withdrew, having failed to break through. In the confusion and violence of that engagement, George FitzClarence was wounded and taken prisoner. The circumstances of his capture are not entirely clear from the surviving record, but what followed is remarkable. He managed to escape in the chaos of the melee, slipping away from his captors amid the close-range struggle of the battle's final stages and returning to his own lines. It was the kind of incident that, once survived, becomes part of a man's identity. evidence of something essential about who he was. George bore a wound from Fuentes d'Onoro that he did not forget. He was promoted after this, given command of a troop in the 10th Hussars, and returned to England for a time before going back to the Peninsula for the final campaigns of 1813 and 1814. In this last phase, he served as a Deputy Assistant Adjutant General on the staff, a more administrative and coordinating role, but one that placed him in the thick of operations as Wellington's army drove the French back across the Pyrenees and into southern France itself. He was mentioned in Wellington's dispatches during this period, a mark of recognition from the greatest British commander of the age. And then, on the 10th of April, 1814, at the Battle of Toulouse, the final major engagement of the entire Peninsular War, George FitzClarence was wounded again, this time severely. He was leading a squadron of the 10th Hussars when he was struck. The wound was serious enough that it marked him, physically, and perhaps in other ways, for the rest of his days. The war ended shortly after Toulouse. Napoleon abdicated and was sent to Elba. The armies that had fought for so long across the mountains and plains of Portugal and Spain began the slow process of returning home. George FitzClarence came back from the Peninsula, a veteran of more than 6 years of active campaigning. He had seen the retreat to Corunna, the brutal attritional fighting of the middle years, and the final push to victory. He had been wounded twice, once taken prisoner. He was 20 years old. His father, who had followed his military career with evident pride, was also, it must be said, deeply concerned about some of George's other habits. The Duke of Clarence was aware that his eldest son had developed a fondness for drink and for gambling, vices that afflicted several of the royal uncles as well, and that the Duke himself was not entirely without experience of. He worried about it. He spoke about it. It did not stop. The years following the end of the Peninsular War marked a significant expansion of George FitzClarence's world and of his self-understanding as a man. In January of 1815, he received a posting to India, and by July of that year, he was in Calcutta, serving on the staff of the Governor-General. He arrived into a subcontinent that was, at that particular moment in history, in a state of considerable upheaval. The East India Company, the great commercial and administrative force through which Britain governed its Indian territories, was engaged in what would become known as the Third Maratha War, a conflict against the Confederacy of Maratha, states that had long been the most significant indigenous power in central India. George's role in India was primarily administrative rather than combat-oriented, reflecting the shift in his career from frontline cavalry officer to senior staff work, but he was present in India through the turbulent years of 1815 to 1817, absorbing what he saw and recording it with the careful attention of a man who intended to write about it. And write about it he did. In 1817 and into 1818, he made his way home from India not by the most direct route, but through Egypt. And it was in Egypt that something happened that would give his journey an unexpected dimension. He encountered there two of the most significant figures in the early history of Egyptology: Henry Salt, the British Consul General in Egypt, and Giovanni Belzoni, the flamboyant Italian-born explorer and antiquarian, who was in the process of conducting some of the most dramatic discoveries in the history of the study of ancient Egypt. George accompanied them to the pyramids at Giza. He explored. He observed. He was, at 23 and 24 years old, moving through one of the most extraordinary chapters of the early 19th century encounter between Europe and the ancient world. He arrived back in England in 1818, and the following year, 1819, he published the record of his journey. The book was called Journal of a Route Across India, through Egypt to England. In the latter end of the year 1817, and the beginning of 1818, and it was brought out by the distinguished London publisher John Murray, who had also published Lord Byron and many of the other great literary figures of the age. The book ran to 502 pages. It included coloured plates based on George's own drawings, maps of his routes, and detailed observations on India during the Maratha War period, on Egypt, and on his encounters with the great monuments of the ancient world. It was not a frivolous travel account. It was the work of a man who had looked carefully at the world and attempted to describe it honestly. He was also, by this time, a married man. On the 18th of October, 1819, at the Church of St. George's in Hanover Square, one of the most fashionable venues for weddings in London, George FitzClarence married Mary Wyndham. Mary was, like George himself, illegitimate. She was the daughter of George Wyndham, the third Earl of Egremont, a man who was one of the most significant art patrons of the Regency era, a figure of immense wealth and cultivated tastes, who had accumulated one of the finest private art collections in England, and his mistress, Elizabeth Fox. Mary had grown up, as George had grown up, in the particular social limbo that illegitimacy imposed, carrying the blood and the manners of the aristocracy, without the legal status that should have accompanied them. In some ways, the match made a kind of emotional sense. Two people who knew exactly what it felt like to stand on the outside of the doors that birth had almost, but not quite, opened for them. The marriage, it should be said, was not notably happy. The social commentator Charles Greville, who knew everyone in society and recorded his observations in the diaries that would later become an invaluable historical source, described Mary Wyndham as a dawdling, ill-conditioned, vexatious wife. This is a harsh assessment, and it is a second-hand one, coloured by all the particular biases and resentments of fashionable London gossip. But it is not, from what can be pieced together of their domestic life, entirely without basis. They were clearly not well suited in temperament, and yet they had 7 children together across the years that followed. 7 children whose own lives would carry the FitzClarence name forward through the turbulent decades of the Victorian era. Their eldest daughter, Adelaide Georgiana, was born in August of 1820 and would live until 1883, never marrying. Their second daughter, Augusta Margaret, was born in July of 1822. She would later marry a Swedish baron, Knut Philip Bonde, in Paris in 1844, only to die of childbed fever in Sweden in 1846, leaving an infant daughter behind. Their eldest son, William George, born in May of 1824, would inherit the earldom after his father's death and carry the title into the next generation. Then came Frederick, born in 1826, who would eventually marry his own first cousin, a pattern of close family marriage not uncommon in the aristocracy of the period. There was a daughter, Mary Gertrude, born around 1832, who died in early childhood, and then, later than might have been expected, 2 more children, a son called George, born in 1836, and a son called Edward, born in 1837, who would grow up to serve in the Crimean War and die of his wounds at the siege of Sevastopol in 1855. Across the 1820s, George FitzClarence continued his military career, advancing in rank and reputation, all while the shape of the life he hoped to lead remained frustratingly just out of reach. The year 1830 changed everything, or at least it changed what was possible. On the 26th of June, 1830, King George IV died. He was followed onto the throne by his brother, Prince William Henry, Duke of Clarence, who now became King William IV of the United Kingdom. After decades of waiting and uncertainty and financial difficulty, and the quiet indignity of a life lived on the margins of the institution to which his blood connected him. The Duke of Clarence was King of England, and with that transformation came a corresponding change in the position of his children. George FitzClarence was 36 years old when his father became king. He had spent nearly his entire adult life as a soldier, a capable, decorated, and respected one, and had demonstrated in print that he had a mind for more than the parade ground and the battlefield. He had published a serious book. He had served on staff in 2 continents. He had, in short, conducted himself in a manner that entitled him, in his own view, and in the view of many who observed him, to something more than the private status of a gentleman's lesser son. The king agreed, or at least, he acted as if he did. On the 4th of June, 1831, William IV created his eldest son, Earl of Munster, Viscount FitzClarence, and Baron Tewkesbury, a substantial grant of titles that placed George, formally and publicly, within the English peerage. The title Earl of Munster was not without its own history. It had been the title held by William himself before his accession, an Irish earldom that he had previously borne during the long years as Duke of Clarence. He was now passing it, in a transformed and elevated form, to his eldest illegitimate son. It was, by the standards of what the law would permit, a remarkable act of paternal recognition. The heraldic arms granted to George at the same time told their own quiet story. His coat of arms consisted of the royal arms of the United Kingdom, the same arms borne by his father the king, but overlaid with a baton sinister, a diagonal stripe running from upper right to lower left that, by the conventions of English heraldry, announced a connection to royal blood that had passed through an irregular union. The anchors with which this baton was decorated were a reference to William's own naval background as a former Lord High Admiral. It was, in its way, a beautiful emblem, honest about what it acknowledged and what it could not change. Along with the earldom, the appointment to his father's household followed. George served as aide-de-camp to King William IV from 1830 to 1837. He was made Lieutenant of the Tower of London from 1831 to 1833, a position of considerable ceremonial dignity and some practical authority. From 1833 to 1842, he held the post of Constable and Governor of Windsor Castle, one of the oldest and most prestigious offices in the royal household, a role that placed him in immediate proximity to the symbolic heart of the English monarchy. He was made a Privy Councillor in 1833, a member of the ancient body that advised the sovereign on matters of state. He was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society and a Fellow of the Royal Astronomical Society, recognitions of his intellectual interests and scholarly engagement. By any objective measure, George FitzClarence had been given a great deal. He had titles, offices, proximity to power, and the formal recognition of a king who was also his father. The reasonable expectation, the expectation that almost anyone observing from outside might have formed, was that this would be enough. It was not enough. George wanted a dukedom. He had the blood of kings, he felt, and a dukedom was what blood like that deserved. The earldom was a recognition, yes, but it was a recognition that placed him alongside the ordinary nobility, not alongside the royal dukes who were his uncles and who occupied an entirely different level of the social hierarchy. He felt the gap keenly. He felt it in every interaction, every ceremony, every formal occasion where the gradations of precedence made visible with excruciating precision, exactly where he stood and exactly what he was. His siblings felt similar dissatisfaction. It was, as more than one historian has noted, a general condition of the FitzClarence children, a shared resentment at provisions that fell short of what their blood seemed to promise. But in George, the eldest, and the one with the most to lose, it took on a particular intensity. There was also money. There was always money. or the lack of it, George spent more than he had, as his father had always done, and as several of his royal uncles had done before him. His habits of drinking and gambling, which his father had worried about since the Peninsular years, continued. The income that came with his offices and his earldom was not sufficient, or at least it was not sufficient for the life he felt entitled to live. He asked his father for more. He asked repeatedly, and in terms that were not always tactful. The quarrels between George FitzClarence and his father, King William IV, did not begin suddenly. They developed over time, gathering force through the accumulated weight of unmet expectations, financial pressures, and, increasingly, something harder to define. A quality of mind in George that seemed to those who knew him to be pulling loose from its moorings. William had been proud of his eldest son. That pride was genuine and documented. He had followed George's military career with attention and satisfaction, had spoken warmly of his campaigns and his wounds and his courage. He had elevated him to the peerage, given him offices, brought him into the household of the crown. He had done, within the limits of what was legally and constitutionally possible, what a father in his position could do. But George was not satisfied, and his dissatisfaction expressed itself in ways that were difficult to absorb. He demanded more than it was possible to give. He raised the question of the dukedom when the question had no answer that would please him. He brought his financial difficulties to his father in terms that were increasingly pressured and, at times, accusatory. The visits that were meant to maintain a relationship became instead occasions of distress, occasions from which the king emerged upset and unsettled. Those close to William came to feel that it was better, for the king's health and peace of mind, to limit the contact between father and son as much as possible, since every meeting seemed to leave the king more troubled than the one before. The estrangement that developed was, in its way, a tragedy for both of them. William clearly continued to love his son, however bewildering he found George's behavior. The grief that the situation caused him was observed by those around him. But love, in the circumstances, was not enough to bridge the gap between what George needed and what it was possible to give. There was one moment, one particular moment, when it seemed as if something might change. In April of 1837, Sophia FitzClarence died. She was George's younger sister, the first daughter that William and Dorothea had produced together, and she had become, over the years, the favourite child of King William IV. She had married Philip Sidney, the first Baron de Lisle and Dudley, and had maintained warm and affectionate relations with her father throughout his reign. Her death, at the age of 41, was a blow that struck the king deeply. It was also an occasion when a reconciliation between George and his father might have been possible. The shared grief of a family bereaved is sometimes the thing that bridges the distances that ordinary life has opened up. Those around the king hoped that it might work that way. It did not. Even Sophia's death did not bring George and his father back together. The breach was complete. It would remain complete until William died. King William IV died on the 20th of June, 1837, at Windsor Castle, having reigned for 7 years. He was 71 years old. The crown passed to his niece Victoria, the 18-year-old daughter of his brother Edward, Duke of Kent, a young woman who had grown up in some degree of deliberate isolation from the world, and who now, suddenly and entirely, became the sovereign of the United Kingdom. Queen Victoria and her FitzClarence cousins had a relationship that was, given the circumstances, surprisingly cordial. The young queen had been kept at some distance from them during her childhood by her mother, the Duchess of Kent, and her mother's controlling advisor, Sir John Conroy, both of whom found the FitzClarence family's unconventional origins distinctly unwelcome. But Victoria herself seems to have felt, once she was queen and free of that supervision, a genuine warmth toward these cousins who carried her uncle's blood. She appointed George as her aide-de-camp in 1837, continuing the role he had held under his father, and he attended her coronation in June of 1838. It was in these years that George FitzClarence also produced some of his most interesting intellectual work. He had always been a man of broader curiosity than his military career alone suggested. In 1831, he had published Memoirs of the Late War, which included his own account of the 1809 campaign in Portugal, a serious military history based on his direct experience of fighting under Wellington. Now, in the late 1830s and early 1840s, he became increasingly engaged with Oriental scholarship, the study of the languages, literatures, and histories of the Islamic world and of India and Persia. He worked with the Austrian Orientalist Alois Sprenger on a catalogue of Arabic, Persian, Turkish, and Hindustani texts on the art of war, published in 1840, and in 1841, Sprenger dedicated to him an English translation of a 10th century Arabic historical encyclopedia by the Abbasid scholar al-Masudi, a work known in translation as Meadows of Gold and Mines of Gems, acknowledging in his preface George's active assistance in rendering the Arabic into English and in compiling the scholarly notes. George was, in other words, not merely a patron of this work, but a genuine intellectual participant in it. For a man whose written English was described, somewhat uncharitably, as imperfect, this represents a rather striking range of intellectual engagement. In 1841, he was elected president of the Royal Asiatic Society, the scholarly body dedicated to the study of the cultures and languages of Asia. It was the highest formal recognition his intellectual interests would receive. But something was happening to George FitzClarence in these final years that no office or honour could arrest. The precise nature of what afflicted him has never been definitively established. At his inquest, following his death, the doctors who had attended him told the coroner that they had believed he was going mad, that the deterioration of his mind had been visible and progressive in the period before the end. The biographer, Philip Ziegler, who wrote the most authoritative study of his father, King William IV, described George's condition in terms of a paranoiac sense of persecution, a feeling deepening over time into a conviction that the world was arranged against him, that the slight of his illegitimacy was being constantly renewed and extended by those around him, that what was owed to him was being deliberately withheld. In more recent years, there has been a suggestion, it remains a suggestion, not a proven diagnosis, that George may have suffered from porphyria. This is a metabolic disorder that affects the nervous system and can produce, in severe cases, symptoms of confusion, agitation, and mental instability. It is sometimes called the royal malady because there is evidence that it affected King George III, George's paternal grandfather, and possibly other members of the House of Hanover. If porphyria did run in the family, it would provide a medical framework for the mental deterioration that overtook George in his final decade. But this remains speculation, and it is worth holding it as such. What is not speculation is the documented reality of his last years. The financial pressures continued and intensified. His requests for additional support became more urgent and, in their framing, more tortured. In 1839, he wrote to William Lamb, the second Viscount Melbourne, who was serving as Queen Victoria's Prime Minister, raising the possibility of his appointment as Governor of Malta, a post that would have provided both income and a degree of dignified distance from the social world of London that had become, for him, increasingly painful. Nothing came of it. In December of 1841, just 3 months before his death, he wrote to the Duke of Wellington himself, the great commander under whom he had fought, the most celebrated military figure in Britain, about money, about the lack of it, about the desperation that had settled over him like a fog. The letter to Wellington is a haunting document to consider. Here was a man who had once ridden as a galloper for Wellington's adjutant general, who had been mentioned in dispatches, who had bled on the same fields that had made Wellington famous, writing in the winter of his life to ask the old Duke for help with his finances. It is the letter of a man who has exhausted other options, of a man who is running out of places to turn. His family had known for some time that something was deeply wrong. The deterioration had been gradual enough that it was easy, for a while, to explain each episode as a temporary difficulty or an exaggerated grievance. But by the early 1840s, there was no longer any comfortable explanation available. Those closest to him were afraid of what was coming. They did not know when, or quite how, but they were not surprised when it arrived. On the 20th of March, 1842, in his home in the Belgravia district of London, a fashionable neighbourhood of white stucco terraces not far from Buckingham Palace, George Augustus Frederick FitzClarence, the first Earl of Munster, took his own life. He was 48 years old. He used a pistol. It was not just any pistol. It had been given to him years before by his uncle, the man who had eventually become King George IV, a gift from a king, kept for years, used finally in the last act of a life that had run out of roads. The first shot went wrong. It struck his hand. George was left, wounded and in pain, while his footman hurried away to find help, having been told, in the moment of confusion, that there had been an accident. While the footman was gone, George changed the pistol to his left hand. He did not wait for help to come. His family, when the news reached them, received it with a grief that was complicated by the fact that they had, for so long, been bracing for something like it. It came as no surprise, one account tells us. That sentence, quiet as it is, contains within it years of worry and fear and love helplessly expressed. His father's biographer wrote that the cause was a paranoid sense of persecution. His own doctors said they had believed he was going mad. His wife Mary, who had lived beside him through all of it, survived him by only 8 months. She died in December of 1842. He was buried at St. Mary's Church in Hampton, in the London borough of Richmond upon Thames, the same parish, not so very far from Bushy House, where he had grown up with his 9 brothers and sisters and his remarkable mother and his royal father, in that strange and vivid and impossible household that defied every convention of its era. The earldom passed to his eldest son, William George FitzClarence, who became the 2nd Earl of Munster and lived an unremarkable Victorian life of hunting and country pursuits, far removed from the turmoil of his father's years. The title would pass through several more generations before finally becoming extinct in the year 2000, with the death of the 7th and last Earl. What are we to make of George FitzClarence? It is a question that does not resolve itself easily, and perhaps it is not meant to. He was, by any honest account, a man of genuine gifts. The courage he showed on the battlefields of the Peninsular War was real. He did not earn his commissions through patronage alone. He fought in some of the hardest engagements of that long conflict, was wounded twice, was captured once and escaped, and came home with the kind of practical, embodied knowledge of war that only actual fighting produces. His books were serious works, not vanity projects. His engagement with Islamic scholarship was the product of genuine intellectual curiosity, the curiosity of a man who had seen India and Egypt with his own eyes and who wanted to understand what he had seen. The range of his honorifics, Fellow of the Royal Society, Fellow of the Royal Astronomical Society, President of the Royal Asiatic Society, speaks to a mind that was engaged with the intellectual life of his age in more than a superficial way. And yet, there is a quality to his story that resists simple admiration, a quality that runs alongside the courage and the scholarship and the genuine achievements. The resentment was real. The demands were unreasonable, or at least some of them were, placed as they were upon a father who had already done what it was possible to do. The quarrels that broke the relationship with William IV were not entirely of George's making, but neither were they entirely imposed from outside. There was something in him, something that the doctors called madness, and that Ziegler called paranoia, and that modern readers might frame in any number of ways, that could not let the account rest at a balance it was never going to reach. He was the product, in part, of a world that had made him a certain kind of promise and then declined to keep it, a world that had given him royal blood and then told him that royal blood in his particular case was insufficient. That injury was real, and it was structural, not merely personal. It shaped him, but he was also a man who made choices, who drank, who gambled, who demanded rather than asked, who alienated the father who loved him. And those choices shaped him too. Both things were true simultaneously. He was a man who deserved sympathy, and who made himself difficult to sympathize with. He was brave and clever, and ultimately broken. And the breaking came from so many directions at once that it is nearly impossible to say where any single cause begins. The FitzClarence family that George founded, or rather, that his father's love and his own marriage brought into being, continued long after his death. His son William led a quiet, aristocratic life. His son George had children, whose descendants carried the family name into the 20th century. His son Edward died as a soldier in the Crimea, as his father's brother Henry had died as a soldier in India. The military inheritance, at least, persisted. The title Earl of Munster passed through 7 generations before the male line of the family that had begun with King William IV and Dorothea Jordan finally came to an end. The last Earl, Anthony FitzClarence, the 7th Earl of Munster, died in the year 2000. He had, in the tradition of his remarkable forebear, made his way in the world through his own abilities, rather than on the strength of his lineage alone, working as a publican, a newspaper graphic designer, and ultimately as an expert in medieval stained glass. King William IV himself remains, in the popular imagination, a somewhat underestimated monarch, the Sailor King, the bluff and cheerful reformer who presided over the passage of the Great Reform Act of 1832, who reigned between the extravagance of George IV and the long, transforming decades of Victoria. His relationship with Dorothea Jordan is now remembered with a mixture of affection and melancholy. She was, by most accounts, the great love of his life, and he spent the rest of his life married to a woman he respected and was fond of but did not love in the same way. There is a well-known portrait of Dorothea Jordan, painted by the artist Hoppner, that captures something of what she was: the warmth, the intelligence, the quality of engagement that made her irresistible to audiences and to the Duke who gave up so much to be with her and then gave her up for a throne. The Bushy House of their shared life still stands. It is now part of the National Physical Laboratory, the great scientific research institution that occupies the grounds of the old Bushy Park estate, the rooms where George FitzClarence grew up, where his mother sang and laughed and organized the household, where his father presided over rowdy dinners and argued about money, are now used for very different purposes, but they are still there. And somewhere in the churchyard of St. Mary's in Hampton, close by the river and the old familiar landscape of that part of the Thames Valley, George Augustus Frederick FitzClarence rests, the 1st Earl of Munster, the King's eldest illegitimate son. The soldier who fought for England in Spain and Portugal. The traveller who explored India and Egypt and wrote about what he found. The scholar who worked alongside Orientalists and scientists and the learned men of his age. The man who wanted more than his birth could give him, and who found, in the wanting, a darkness from which he never fully emerged. He was 48 years old. He had lived enough lives for several men, and this has been his story, told gently and with care on Sleepy Crown Reborn. We hope it has carried you toward rest. We hope the quiet hours ahead are peaceful ones, and we will meet you again when you are ready for the next journey through the lives of those who shaped the world we inherited. Good night.